All right. Welcome to our Math Live for May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. We're going to be looking at fractions and multiplying fractions today. Specifically, what we're looking at, we're going to start with multiplying fractions by whole numbers, so like 5 times a half, and then we're going to look at multiplying a fraction by a fraction. And as we do this, we're going to do it in 3 different ways. So what we'll do is I'll show you a super quick method of multiplying fractions. And then we'll also show 2 ways of sort of understanding what's happening underneath, which to me is always the most interesting part of the math, is to try to understand like why it works the way it does. So that's our goal. And again, we're going to be doing this directly from your practice assignment today. So starting with just the week plan, again, our goal is multiplying and dividing fractions, spending the first 3 days with multiplying fractions, and then the 4th day with dividing fractions, and an assignment for Friday. So today, what you're going to be doing, there's some videos for you to watch if you want some more explanation. You're going to be working on this worksheet, and then tomorrow you'll work on this one. And what I've done is taken 2 problems from each of these, and we're going to look at them together today. So over here, we'll get started right away. We're going to start with something very, very simple. When we're multiplying fractions, we're just thinking about multiplication the way we always know it. Multiplication is about groups of something. But another way to think about it is you can think about it in terms of area, right? So if you imagine 3 times 4, you can think of it as like 3 rows and 4 columns. We'll use a similar way to think about this here. You can also think about it on a number line as well. I'm going to show you this quick way as well. That's what we'll start with. We'll start with the just like survival skill mode of doing this. And so when we're looking at 1/4 times 2, we're thinking like this: 1/4 times 2. And I'm actually going to write 2 as 2 wholes, like 2 over 1. So we're looking at this problem here. And you notice that this has the word of underneath. I want you to just take a moment and think about why that has the word of underneath the multiplication sign. Well, it's because when we're multiplying, we're thinking of taking a group of something. So this is 1/4 of 2. So we're talking about taking not even a full group of 2, but 1/4 of 2, right? So these are kind of the same operation. You see a multiplication sign and you see a fraction of something, you should be thinking about multiplying fractions. So here we go. And the fast way that we're going to multiply fractions is we're just going to take the numerator and the numerator of the 2 factors, and we're going to multiply them. So 1 times 2 gives me 2. That's my numerator of my product. And then I'm going to look at the denominators, and they are 4 times 1. And I'm going to multiply those denominators together, and that is going to give me the denominator of my product. This gives me 2 quarters. And of course, this makes sense. If you think about 1/4 times 2, and you just visualize it with money, take 2 quarters. What do you have? Well, you have 2 quarters. And 2 quarters you can reduce, of course, to 1/2 if you wanted to do so. Okay, so that's the really fast way, and this is a very simple example for us to start with. But I'm going to show it to you in a couple different ways, because then we're going to start to crack open why the multiplication works the way that it does. Okay, so we're going to look at this same example. We're going to use a number line. And on this number line, we are going to start by representing the idea of 1/4. And so just here, if we start every number at 0, if we imagine numbers are really just arrows that start from 0 and go a certain length, right? So the number 5 is just an arrow 5 numbers long. Well, in this case, 1/4 would just be an arrow that's 1/4 long. So here's 0, here's 1, halfway in the middle is about here, and 1/4 is about there. So there's 1/4. And if we're thinking about multiplication, we're thinking about, again, repeated groups. So when we see 1/4 times 2, then we're going to think of 2 groups of 1/4. So here's 1/4, and here is a 2nd quarter. And you can see that our 2nd quarter has us arrive at 2 quarters, or 1/2. Again, same product as when we did it through the quick method. But you should always be trying to think of ways to visualize math, because that's how your brain's going to really be able to work with numbers efficiently and quickly, and in a way that means that you'll be able to apply your math skills to real world problems. So by the way, another way that you could do this question, instead of thinking of it as 2 groups of 1/4, you could start with the 2 and you could extend a line that's 2 units long. So you could start that way. And then we could think about what is 1/4 of 2. So then we could take this line and we could split it into quarters. There would split it in half. Here would split it into quarters. The question is, what is 1/4 of that line? So 1/4 of that green line is right here. And where did that orange line end up? That 1/4. So this is 1/4 of 2. Where did it end up? It ended up right here at 1/2. Okay, so here's one way, 2 ways, and then we're going to look at a third way. The third way that we're going to look at is using what we would call area models. So representing the idea of multiplying by thinking about it in terms of area, length times width. So anytime you have 2 numbers multiplied together, you can think of it as one representing a length of something, one representing a width or a height of something, and then the product of that multiplication is the area that gets created as a result. So we're going to just take a look at that. Just going to do a really quick check here. Okay, good. All right, so when we're multiplying with fractions, we want to have reference to what 1/2 is. So I've kind of put a grid down here just to help me out, and you could do the same. You could do this on grid paper. I'm going to just start up in this corner right here of a grid. And what this grid is it's 1 by 1. So I'm going to just show you what a 1 by 1 square looks like. Oops, I'm not very good at drawing straight lines with my screen pen, so I apologize. There's a 1 by 1 square. So this here represents a product of 1, right? If this was 1 by 1, we'd have a product of 1. And that's going to be like our reference point when we're thinking about multiplying anything using this kind of representation. So now if we're thinking about, well, what does 2 look like? Well, 2 looks like 2 squares. There's a second one there. And I'm just going to erase the 1 out of the middle of this because it kind of gets in the way. So there we have a represented idea of 2. And then what we're asking is, well, what is 1/4 of that? So what's 1/4 of what we're looking at here? So I'm going to take this and I'm going to divide it into a quarter. Now you notice that I've already done the number 2 along this length here, right? If you look along this top line, this shape is already 2 wide. And down here, it's 1 wide. And so right now I've represented the idea 1 times 2 or 2 times 1. But I don't want that. I want 1/4 times 2. So this dimension's okay. It goes too long. But I'm actually going to change this one so it matches the problem. Let's make it a quarter. So if this is 1 long, well, then a half length would be from here to there. And a quarter length would be to this line here. So it would be this dimension here that represents 1/4. And now I've represented this area. We're going to use orange to show our sort of answer as drawn. Now notice what I've done is I've shaded in a long orange rectangle. You can kind of ignore the blue, let it fade into the background. And what you should be able to see, I'm just going to do a big 2 here, is that we have a rectangle that is 2 units long on one dimension and 1/4 wide on the other dimension, right? You can think of these like meters. I just did a bunch of gardening. I made a bunch of garden beds. So you could imagine like this is a garden bed that's a 1/4 of a meter wide and 2 meters long. So the question is how much space is inside of here? And hopefully you can see that if you take the orange area here, that's our answer, and we sort of rearrange it, like if we took this part and put it here, right? So if we kind of moved it down, it would fill in this space. And what you would be able to see, I'm going to do it in red now. So once I've rearranged my orange area, what I have all together is a space something like this. And how big is that space? Well, it's 1/2 the size of one of those reference squares. So we're going to look back at these blue squares here now. And remember, when we started setting up our drawing, we made it so that a square this big was worth 1. And so this square should be worth 1/2 of 1 unit. And that's the exact same product product answer that we get as if we do it the other way. Now, I've taken a long time to draw out this just to really explain the thinking here. As we do the next question, we'll do it kind of quicker and more efficiently, and I'll show you how to do it so it feels like it takes less time. But the idea is to really kind of understand why this multiplying works the way that it does. Trying to do this in half the time or less of the last example. This is 3 times 2/5. Okay, now if we're thinking about 3 times 2/5, we're thinking about something like 3 groups of 2/5. So we could think of this as 2/5 plus 2/5 plus 2/5, right? There's 3 of them and each are 2/5. Now, if we're going to use our very quick method here and multiply the numerators together, I'd go 3 times 2 and I should get 6 as my numerator. And then the denominator under the 3 here should be a 1. And so 1 times 5, right, because this is 3 wholes. 1 times 5 gives me 5 as my denominator, and there would be my product. It would be 6/5. And you can see that same answer if we consider it broken into addition, right? 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. So we have 6/5. If we're going to show this on a number line, then we would think about 3 groups of 2/5. And so splitting my number line into 2/5. So if we had this split into 1, 2, 3, 4, there's each of those is a fifth, each of those little tick lines. One more time, here is 2/5 and another 2/5 and another 2/5, which is, well, that leaves us at 6/5, which you can hopefully see is just a little bigger than 1, right? And so we could write this as its mixed number, 1 and 1/5. It's just 1/5 past 1, okay? So there we go with the number line. And now we're going to do a visual representation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up at a corner here. I'm going to do my first dimension, which is 3. So I'm going to go across 1, 2, 3. This is 3 units long. And then I'm going to do my second dimension here. And my second dimension is 2/5. So I'm not even going to go 1 full length, right? Because 2/5 is not 1 full length. 2/5 is just a little under half. So let's say that that is about 2/5, that dimension. And that's going to form a rectangle. And my rectangle is this long thing that's 2/5 by 3. Right? And each of these has an area of 2/5, right? Each of these black squares, right? Because this is 2/5 by 1. Each of these is 2/5 by 1. And so this has 2/5 in it, this has 2/5 in it, and this has 2/5 in it. And so really, you can see it's the exact same situation as this situation here. 3 groups of 2/5, add them all up. How many do you have? You got 6. And so our product is 6/5. There you go. Hopefully that was a little more fast and efficient and less explainy than the previous one. Again, you can see those 3 different representations. All right, so at this point now, you may want to decide whether you have seen enough math and you're like, okay, my brain's just getting this stuff now, I'm just understanding it. At which point you might just want to go and start working on the practice for today, because these are 2 questions from that practice, and you can move on from here. I'm going to carry on and I'll do 2 more examples, and those 2 examples come from the practice tomorrow. So if you want to see those now and just see them all live, then you can do so. If you want to move on and get today's practice done, you're welcome to tune out from this, this meet, and you can watch the second part tomorrow when you're working on those problems. All right, so this is where things get a little more complicated, as we're going to look at multiplying a fraction by another fraction. So here we have 3/4 times 1/2. And in terms of the quick, easy, shortcut way of doing this work, it's not more difficult. In fact, it's maybe easier because you don't have to add a 1 as your denominator. Here we just have 3/4 times 1/2, and to multiply the numerators together, you would get 3, and the denominators together, you would get 8. So you know your product is 3/8. And that's kind of what's nice about this work, is that you can find the correct answer very, very quickly. And ultimately what we're looking at is, do you understand how that works? And can you apply all these other skills, like being able to think using a number line or think using area and that kind of thing, right? Because those are the skills that you'll actually end up using more. especially the area stuff. So let's actually start with that version this time, and then we'll do the number line at the end. So our product's going to be 3/8. We know that. What we're going to do is we're going to start up again in some corner somewhere, and we're going to trace out a shape that's 3/4 by 1/2. Now, before I start, I'm going to trace out a reference square that's 1 by 1, noting that both of these factors are less than 1, right? That's less than 1, and this is less than 1. And because those are both less than 1, I can fit this whole question inside of a 1 by 1 square. And that's already going to tell me something, which is I should expect my answer to never be bigger than 1 here, right? There's no way I can have something that's only 3/4 of something wide by 1/2 and have the area be 1. Let's sketch out a big unit area. Just before I do that, I'm going to look at something for a second. I'm just going to look at the denominators here. And I notice the denominators are a 4 and a 2. And there's a common factor between those denominators. And the common factor, oops, how did I go away? The common factor is 4 in this case. And so what I'm going to do when I draw my reference square is I'm actually going to make it use 4 grid lines. So I'm going to do one here and one there, and you'll see why in a second. And 1, 2, 3, 4, and there. Okay, so this is going to represent 1 unit wide, and this is going to represent 1 unit wide. And what that means is each of these little grid lines represents a quarter on each of these dimensions. So this is my reference square. That square has an area of 1. Now let's represent this, this idea of 3/4 of 1/2. So we're going to start on 1 dimension, and we're going to trace out 3/4. So I'm going to do this square in orange. Starting in this corner, I'm going just 3/4 of the way across the width of my square. So there's the 3/4 mark, and this dimension here now in orange is 3/4. And on the other dimension, I'm going to go 1/2 of the way. So I'm going to go 1/2 of 1 unit. So that puts me just right here. There's 1/2 of a unit. So now I have traced out 2 dimensions. One is 3/4 and one is 1/2. And if I close in the square that creates, I end up with a square that, or sorry, I shouldn't call it a square. Shouldn't call it a square. It is a rectangle, and it is a 3/4 by 1/2 rectangle. And what you might notice then is now we can start to see what the area of this. We can see that it is something like 3/8. And here's how we can do that. If we look at our original 1 by 1 square, and we start to kind of chop it up, well, if we chop it up into these little tiles, each of these little tiles is actually 1/16, right? This is 1/16, one of these little tiles. You could see that if you saw that there were 16 that fit inside of here. But if we put 2 of these together, like these 2 together, that represents 1/8 of our total square. You can see that I can fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those in there. One of those is 1/8. And let's take a look at how many of those 8ths fit inside of my product, the orange area. Well, there's 1/8, there's 2/8, and here is 3/8. And you can see that I get the same product. I get 3/8 as my product here. Like, to me, this is like such cool math, right? And it's very, very visual, and it requires attention to detail. But if you use some grid paper, you take your time with it, you can really represent something fairly complex using pretty cool images here to understand how this all works. So there's an area model for this. And then if we're going to do a number line model, this is also going to be kind of tough. So here we go. I'm going to modify my number line here because I don't like that this goes to 4. I don't need those numbers. So we again notice that my product is less than 1 here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to maybe make this worth 1. And we're going to go and we're going to call this 3/4. And we're going to call this 2/4. And we're going to call this 1/4. Okay, so I've just replaced those measurements on my number line in this case. Okay, you can do that. There's no reason you have to follow what the number line says. So I'm just going to clean this up a bit. We had just split these into quarters on our number line here. And so we're going to represent our first number. If you look in our question we're working with, our first number is 3/4. So let's represent 3/4. We're going to use a big arrow here going from 0 to 3/4. Okay, so this arrow is 3/4 of a unit long, right? There's one over here, and it's only 3/4 of the way there. So this is 3/4 long. And now the question is, well, what is half of that? So let's look at this. We're going from here to here. You can imagine it like we're walking to the store or something like that. Here I am, and you know, maybe there's the store here, and I'm wondering like, what is halfway on my journey between here and there? And the answer is it's about right there if I chop this in half. And if I chop this in half, well, and I talk about, okay, well, what's the half journey look like? Well, there's my half journey in green. And where does that take me? Well, that half journey takes me exactly between 1/4 and 2/4. And I don't have a marking there on my number line for that. But if I chop my number line down a little finer, so if I chop each of these lengths in half and call each of these half of 1/4, then these are each 1/8. So there's 1/8, there's 2/8. That puts me at the 1/4 mark. And then here is 3/8 is halfway to 3/4. And once again, we get the same product. So 3 different ways to represent a multiplication with fractions. I think we're going to leave it at this example. That is multiplying fractions. Good luck with your practice.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Mr. Hayes.
Yes, of course. As always, we're here, so get in touch if you need anything. A little later.
Bye, guys.
See you, Ms. Browner.